Welcome back to our channel. In late December 1890, on the northern plains, United States troops moved to disarm a mini-Kanju Lakota camp that had come toward Pine Ridge for safety after weeks of fear and winter travel. The soldiers were elements of the 7th Cavalry acting under departmental orders to suppress what officials called unrest linked to the ghost dance. The Lakota families were led by Spotted Elk, known to the Army as Bigfoot, who was gravely ill as the column crossed the frozen country. The march halted near Wounded Knee Creek, South Dakota, where the snow lay hard on the grass and the wind cut along the low ridges. Before dawn, the plan was set. Men would gather in a circle. Weapons would be surrendered. Lodges would be searched. Artillery crews posted their guns on a rise that commanded the valley floor. The scene did not appear extraordinary to the officers who had spent the month riding between agencies and railheads. It did feel precarious to the mothers who held children close, and to the young men who believed that rifles were the last protection against hunger and arrest. Interpreters moved between lines and tried to hold the words steady. The interpreter task was not only language, it was fear-controlled timing and trust on a morning when one hard movement could undo the camp. Above them, the sky was clear and brittle, with the sound of horses and chains. The sick leader lay under blankets in a wagon. This episode asks a precise question. What sequence of treaties, allotment policy, ration dependence, press, panic, and winter enforcement brought these actors to this narrow bowl of ground, and why did the killing that followed carry far beyond the ravine to become a national reckoning in newspapers, classrooms, museums, and the living memory of Lakota communities? The road to Wounded Knee was not a sudden path of misunderstanding, but a long corridor built by treaties, policy, hunger, and fear. 2 decades before the shots, the Fort Laramie Treaty of 1868 had recognized a vast Sioux reservation stretching from the Missouri River west toward the Bighorn country and promised that no white settlers would enter without consent. Within 8 years, that promise was broken. The Black Hills sacred to the Lakota drew miners after gold was found, and the United States, unwilling to enforce its own boundary, demanded new cessions. The defeat of Custer in 1876 was followed by retribution. The Great Sioux Reservation was carved into smaller agencies, and military oversight merged with the bureaucratic control of Indian agents. By the mid-1880s, allotment became the federal tool of reform. The Dawes Act of 1887 authorized the division of communal lands into individual parcels and the sale of surplus acreage to settlers. For the Lakota, that meant the loss of more than half of their remaining land within 3 years. Rations, beef flour, sugar, coffee, and small allotments of clothing became the currency of survival. When Congress reduced appropriations in 1890, officials at Pine Ridge and Rosebud cut rations by nearly half. Starvation and disease spread through the agencies. Buffalo were gone. Hunting grounds fenced or leased. Families relied on wagons to haul meager supplies from distant railheads. In this vacuum of faith and food, a spiritual movement rose from Nevada and swept eastward. It was called the Ghost Dance, a vision of restoration and peace preached by Wovoka, a northern Paiute prophet. His message was simple: live rightly, do no harm, dance in circles, and the old world, the buffalo, the ancestors, the balance would return. To Indian agents and army officers, it looked like insurrection. Dances of hundreds of people moving through the snow with painted faces and white shirts seemed to signal war, not renewal. Reports to Washington exaggerated danger, and newspapers in Chicago, Omaha, and New York printed sensational sketches of hostile Indians preparing for uprising. At the same time, bureaucratic confusion deepened. The Interior Department supervised Indian agencies, while the War Department commanded troops. Each accused the other of hesitation. Agents feared that without soldiers, their agencies would fall. Generals believed that civilian officials provoked tension through poor management. Caught between were thousands of Lakota families who faced the twin pressures of hunger and the threat of armed patrols. The immediate spark came in December 1890. At Standing Rock Agency, police attempted to arrest Sitting Bull, believing that his presence encouraged the ghost dance. The operation ended in chaos. Gunfire killed Sitting Bull and several followers. The news raced across the telegraph lines, igniting panic on every reservation. At Cheyenne River, Miniconjou leader Spotted Elk knew the tension would reach his people next. Sick with pneumonia and fearing arrest, he gathered his bandmen, women, and children and set out for Pine Ridge, hoping for protection under Chief Red Cloud and the local agent. Army columns moved simultaneously. The 7th Cavalry under Major Samuel Whitside, reinforced by Colonel James Forsyth, was ordered to intercept Spotted Elk's band and escort them to Pine Ridge. The mission was described as for their safety, but the language of the orders emphasized vigilance and the confiscation of arms. Soldiers brought 4 Hotchkiss guns, rapid-fire artillery mounted on carriages whose presence signaled not peacekeeping, but coercion. As the Miniconjou advanced south through snow and bitter wind, scouts and interpreters rode ahead to meet them. Each encounter carried tension, surrender, misunderstanding, mistranslation. Spotted Elk raised a white flag and permitted escort. Witnesses later described the column as exhausted and half-frozen, moving slowly with travois wagons and small ponies. The soldiers led them toward Wounded Knee Creek, a narrow valley just north of Pine Ridge Agency. There, under an open sky and a cutting wind, the soldiers encamped the Lakota for the night of December 28th. The policy that brought them together was the culmination of every contradiction in United States Indian administration. Civil versus military control, humanitarian rhetoric versus coercive enforcement reform through property versus the destruction of community. Each law and order, each budget cut, and telegraphed rumor layered into an equation that no interpreter could resolve. What began as a promise of allotment and civilization ended as an armed encirclement in deep winter. The stage was set. At dawn, officers would search every lodge and take every weapon. They believed peace required control. The Lakota believed survival required dignity and protection for their families. Between those two beliefs lay a strip of frozen ground called Wounded Knee Creek, and within its silence, the weight of the entire century pressed down. In the second half of December 1890, the signals that had been building all year began to break into events that no single official could slow. On the 15th of December at Standing Rock, agency police rode to arrest the Hunk Papa leader, Sitting Bull, before daylight. The plan relied on speed authority and the hope that a respected man would comply. Instead, a crowd formed in the cold yard outside his house. Voices rose. A gun flashed. By the time the smoke drifted away, Sitting Bull and several others lay dead. The telegram lines carried the news before the bodies were lifted. Agents south and west read the brief messages as proof that the ghost dance made every camp a threat. Families along the Grand and Moreau and Cheyenne rivers read it as proof that an arrest could turn to killing without warning. Scouts and couriers rode in widening circles. Horses were kept saddled. Children were kept indoors. Chiefs counted the men who still had rifles and the rounds left in their pouches. The fear was simple and practical. If soldiers came at dawn, would anyone have time to explain? At Cheyenne River, the Miniconjou leader Spotted Elk was already ill with a hard winter sickness. He could see the snow lines tightening around the agency and the rumor lines tightening around his name. He chose the least dangerous path he could see. He would take his band south toward Pine Ridge, where Red Cloud still held influence and where the agent might protect a sick chief and the families traveling with him. They packed quickly. Lodges were broken down and loaded on travois. Wagons creaked forward with blankets, kettles, and a few spare poles. The road would be slow because there were children and elders, and because the cold cut into every stop and start. A white flag was tied to the lead wagon in the ordinary hope that soldiers would recognize an intent to submit to escort rather than to resist. Army orders moved on a parallel track. The 7th Cavalry had been called into the region weeks earlier, and now it received direct instructions to locate Spotted Elk and to bring the band under control. The language of the orders stressed custody and the removal of arms. The officers requisitioned 4 Hotchkiss guns and the teams to pull them, Those guns were not meant for a negotiation, but for dominance over ground. Snow and wind made the roads heavy. Telegraphs that carried brief orders to the posts could not carry tone. Interpreters would have to supply tone at the meetings in the open. On the 23rd of December, scouts found the Miniconjou on the White River Road. Spotted Elk raised the white flag again and accepted an escort. Witnesses from both sides later agreed about the condition of the people. They were tired, cold, and worried. The soldiers formed flanks, and the column began to move south. Each halt became a small negotiation. Some men handed in their rifles. Others asked to keep a weapon for hunting and for wolves on the night trail. The interpreters explained that weapons would be collected at the agency and that safety required disarmament. They also explained that there were women and children in every wagon and that fear would cause mistakes if the soldiers searched roughly. The task became less about translating words and more about translating risk. Through Christmas week, the weather turned worse. The column crossed low divides and followed draws that gave a little shelter from the wind. Snow dusted the loads and the faces in the wagons. Soldiers gave out a few hard biscuits and beans and kept the march measured. One day the scouts rode ahead and came back with a rumor that another small group was moving east behind the ridges. Another day, an ambulance was sent forward for Spotted Elk, who could no longer ride. His cough racked him, and he lay under quilts in the bed of the wagon. The officer in command of the escort kept repeating the routine. Keep the column together. Keep the men calm. Keep the weapons under guard, but do not provoke a fight on the road. On the 28th of December, the escort brought the band to the valley of Wounded Knee Creek, north of Pine Ridge. The valley is a narrow bowl of willows with low ground along the water and a ridge that overlooks the campsites. The soldiers placed the Lakota lodges near the creek and unlimbered the Hotchkiss guns on the high ground where the gunners could see the entire camp. The choice was logical from an artillery manual and ominous from any other perspective. Families tried to make a meal. Soldiers posted pickets. The interpreter walked between the fires and explained again what would happen in the morning. Men would gather in an assembly and turn in their guns. The officers would search the lodges for hidden weapons. When the search was done, the band would be escorted to the agency. The interpreter understood that every clause contained a shock to pride and a threat to safety. He also understood that the guns on the ridge made refusal into a kind of surrender without terms. News of the capture and encampment moved outward by telegraph and by rumor. At Pine Ridge, the agency buildings filled with people seeking shelter and with others seeking news. Some wanted the army to end the ghost dance by any means. Others wanted the army to keep its distance and to let the agents handle the camps with food and patience. The tension inside the agency was real, because every outcome would be measured by neighbors who had to live together when the soldiers left. Before dawn, on the 29th of December, the soldiers formed companies around the camp and ordered the men to assemble. The officers aimed at a complete disarmament, because anything less would be seen as weakness by their superiors and as danger by their own ranks. The Lakota men aimed at a partial surrender because anything more would be seen by their families as a road to helplessness in winter. The interpreter stood between those aims with only his voice and his reputation to work with. He asked for calm. He asked for time. He asked that the sick leader be left in the wagon. He asked that the search be done with respect. The wind rose and cloth flapped against poles. The Hotchkiss crews stood by their pieces and waited for orders that they hoped would never come. At this point, even distant commanders began to question the logic of the cordon. One letter written weeks later captured the judgment that would shape the national discussion. Nelson A. Miles' letter, Chicago, 1891. The trouble at Wounded Knee was the result of a disposition to punish rather than to disarm, and of a failure to exercise judgment and coolness where women and children were gathered under the guns. The excerpt is brief and pointed. It reflects what the ground was already saying through posture and placement. A camp that held families had been encircled. Artillery stood on high ground above lodges. Men were told to give up their guns while they could see the muzzles aimed down. Any small resistance could trigger firing in every direction. That morning, a struggle over a single rifle would be enough. But in the hours before that shot, the rising incidents were not only visible in the newspapers and official returns. They were audible in the language of orders and in the silences between translations. They were written in the slow wagons on the winter road, and in the way a sick leader breathed under a blanket while his people waited for decisions made by others. The escalation, therefore, was not a sudden surge toward violence, but a steady tightening of lines around a single place. A leader who sought refuge, an army that sought compliance, an agency system that balanced food and fear, interpreters who tried to hold two worlds together for one more hour. When the sun reached the rim of the ridge, the lines had already been drawn. What remained was the smallest accident to decide whether the day would close with an orderly stack of rifles or with the sound of shells raking the snow. At first light on the 29th of December 1890, the frost lay like glass across the valley of Wounded Knee Creek. The sky was pale and cold, the air dry and still. Soldiers of the 7th Cavalry formed ranks around the Miniconjou Lakota camp. One company to the north, one to the south, others stretching east and west to close the circle. The Hotchkiss guns, 4 in total, stood high on the ridge line, each angled downward toward the lodges. Beneath the frozen canvas, families stirred. Women gathered children and boiled what remained of the night's rationed food. Men wrapped blankets tight and stepped into the open as ordered. The sick leader, Spotted Elk, lay in the ambulance wagon at the edge of camp, breathing shallowly in the bitter air. His white flag still hung limp beside the wheel. Major Samuel Whitside had taken the band into custody the day before. Colonel James Forsyth now commanded the combined force around 470 soldiers armed with rifles, revolvers, and the 4 light artillery pieces. Their orders were to disarm the band completely before escorting them to Pine Ridge Agency. The procedure was on paper simple. Assemble the men, collect their weapons, search the lodges, and ensure compliance. But the ground was uneven, the emotions sharper than the frost and language a fragile thread holding 2 anxious groups together. Company lines stood just 50 yards from the circle of men. Lieutenant Garlington directed that each Lakota man bring forward his rifle for inspection. Some complied, placing weapons in a pile near the center. Others hesitated. Many of the guns were old or broken. A few were new repeaters, Winchesters bought from traders before the ban. Soldiers whispered that more were hidden in the lodges. The interpreter, Philip Wells, moved between Forsyth and the Lakota, relaying orders in both directions, his voice hoarse from the cold. The search began. Soldiers entered lodges, overturning bedding and possessions. Women cried out as they saw rifles taken. One young man refused to give up his gun. Another argued that he had already turned in the one he owned. The tension thickened as more weapons were found. The pile at the center grew a visible monument of surrender. Forsyth ordered his men to press further. The last guns must be collected, he said, for safety. Around the ring, soldiers' hands tightened on their weapons. Many had served through the Great Sioux War and carried old resentments. The ghost dance had been described in newspapers as rebellion. Now the men believed they were standing inside it. Shortly after 10 o'clock, a detail moved toward a young Lakota named Black Coyote. He was deaf and did not understand the order to surrender his rifle. It was a new Winchester said to have cost him dear in trade. He held it high, shaking his head. A soldier grabbed the barrel. Another reached for the stock. The gun went off, whether by accident, struggle, or panic, no one could later say. The sound split the frozen air. In that single crack, discipline vanished. From the ridge above, the Hotchkiss crews swung their guns toward the camp. Infantrymen fired in all directions. Some shot at shadows, some at movement. The Lakota men caught in the open dropped or ran. Women screamed and clutched their children. Bullets tore through the tippies. The air filled with powder smoke and drifting snow. Soldiers of Company K fired volleys into the crowd. The Hotchkiss shells burst among wagons and horses, tearing gaps through canvas and flesh. In minutes, the circle became a maze of chaos. Men firing at soldiers, soldiers firing into lodges. Horses bolting through the crossfire. Spotted elk tried to rise coughing blood before collapsing again beneath the wagon canvas. His daughter, Yellowbird Woman, threw herself over him. She was killed instantly. The gun crews kept firing until ordered to cease. But the valley's shape carried echoes. Bursts sounded even after the main fusillade had ended. Survivors tried to flee up the ravine toward the open hills. Cavalrymen pursued them for more than a mile, firing carbines into the snow. When the firing stopped, the field was still except for the moans of the wounded and the creak of settling wagons. The casualty lists written afterward differ, but the weight of evidence is grimly consistent. Roughly 200 Lakota were killed, more than half of them women and children. About 30 soldiers died, many from their own comrades' bullets in the confusion. The numbers alone, written in ledgers, could not contain what the ground bore. Captain Winfield Edgerly wrote later that the firing had been too rapid for command. Lieutenant Hawthorne described the scene simply, "It was not a battle. It was the killing of a camp." Nelson, A Miles Telegram, Rapid City, 1891. A most unjustifiable and unnecessary massacre. After the firing, soldiers walked among the fallen, collecting weapons and counting bodies. Some carried the wounded to the agency hospital. Others stripped the dead for identification or burial detail. The Hotchkiss crews stood silent beside their guns. The interpreter Wells, whose nose had been grazed by a bullet, wrote later that he wished he had never lived to see that morning. When word reached Pine Ridge, alarm spread through the agency. Red Cloud's followers fortified their own positions, fearing the army would turn next upon them. Civilians fled to the churches and agency buildings. For 2 days, officers prepared for an attack that never came. The snow fell again, covering the bodies at Wounded Knee Creek until burial parties could return. On the 1st of January, 1891, soldiers placed the frozen dead in a trench on the hillside, 146 by the count of the official detail. Later searches found more beneath drifts, bringing the total closer to the figure known in Lakota memory, around 300 souls. The confrontation did not end in the valley. Reports and rumors raced across the country. Some newspapers hailed the army for suppressing an uprising. Others printed the word that would change the meaning: forever massacre. Telegrams from officers used cautious phrases: lamentable affair, unfortunate incident, but General Miles, reading the returns in Chicago, broke the pattern. He ordered an immediate investigation, relieved Forsyth of command, and demanded written explanations from every officer present. In Washington, officials tried to contain the scandal. The War Department issued bulletins emphasizing confusion and self-defense. The Interior Department distanced itself, insisting the matter was purely military. Yet the visual evidence, bodies of women and children frozen in snow, could not be erased. Photographs taken by civilian correspondents circulated in Eastern newspapers within weeks. For many Americans who had never seen a reservation, these images became the first direct vision of federal Indian policy made visible in death. Meanwhile, the survivors began to move. Small groups of wounded men and women reached Pine Ridge under Army escort. Others hid in ravines until the weather cleared. They told of mothers shot while holding infants, of men trying to shield families, of horses bleeding into the snow. Their statements, later taken by journalists and missionaries, converged into one central truth: the camp had been surrounded and destroyed while under a flag of truce. In the army camps, silence replaced triumph. Men who had fought through major wars could not justify what they had seen. Sergeant Dunn of the 7th Cavalry wrote privately that he wished the ground had opened and swallowed the command. Orders were issued forbidding soldiers to speak to the press. Yet letters still found their way into circulation, quoting words of regret and disbelief. The physical campaign was over, but the confrontation entered a new terrain: paper inquiry and conscience. Congressional committees received petitions demanding investigation. Clergymen in the East preached sermons calling for repentance. The national conversation that followed would transform the meaning of Wounded Knee from a necessary operation into a symbol of tragedy and moral failure. For the Lakota, the reckoning had begun the moment the guns fell silent. The dead were kin. The survivors carrying the memory would tell it across generations through winter, Count's drawings and songs. To them, there was no confusion about what had happened. The people had come under escort seeking safety. The soldiers had fired. The snow had covered the evidence. And the wind across the frozen valley carried the voices of the lost into the long winter that followed. In the official records, the language of the confrontation remained sterile. Disarmament, completed casualties, regretted band dispersed. But beneath those lines lies the unchanging geometry of the ground ridge above creek. Below the distance between control and compassion, measured in a few yards of snow. What occurred there was not a tactical decision alone, but the collision of policy fear and human error, a collision that would echo through law memory and conscience for generations to come. The turning point came in the hours after the first shots on the 29th of December, 1890 at Wounded Knee Creek. The objective of the soldiers that morning had been complete disarmament, followed by an escorted march to Pine Ridge. The constraints were winter weather, a sick leader frightened families' limited interpreters, and a cordon laid too tight around a mixed camp. Once the Hotchkiss shells fell and fire swept the lodges, the purpose of the operation collapsed. The event no longer matched any lawful aim. The ground itself forced a different kind of decision. Men who had come to seize rifles now found themselves lifting bodies and binding wounds. The army stood in the valley with the evidence of its own error scattered in the snow. The immediate effect was a hard stillness. Smoke drifted low. Horses trembled and bled. The interpreter pressed cloth to his face and looked for children who were still breathing. Details returned and counted. Burial parties moved along the creek bed. Some soldiers stared at their boots and would not meet each other's eyes. Others tried to make the field conform to a word like battle and found that it would not. A few Lakota men who had escaped into the draws watched from the rim and weighed whether to fire again or to fade into the hills. They chose to fade. There was no field to hold. There was only the work of finding kin and of drawing breath for another day. Names survive in memory. Spotted Elk lay under blankets and did not rise again. Survivors later spoke of Yellowbird Woman, who died near the wagon. Children with no strength to speak were carried to the agency hospital. Ledger artists would later draw the valley with curved lines of flight and small figures falling beneath the arcs of shell fire. Winter counts marked the year with a simple phrase, the time they were killed at the small stream. That short line is the human cost in the language of memory. It carries no numbers and no decoration. It states a fact that the country would have to face. The official system began to react even as the bodies were lifted. Officers wired returns that emphasized confusion and self-defense. The department commander read the messages and the casualty ratios and did not accept the framing. Within days, he removed the local commander and called for sworn statements. A phrase entered the record that would shape understanding for generations. Nelson A. Miles letter, Chicago, 1891. It was a most abominable criminal military blunder and a horrible massacre of women and children, and there was no justification for it. That sentence is an admission against interest from the senior soldier responsible for the theater. It crossed the boundary between internal correspondence and public knowledge. Newspapers began to print not only the Army narrative, but also the words that condemned the action from within the chain of command. The turning point, therefore, was not solely the last shot in the valley. It was also the first clear acknowledgement in writing that the operation had violated judgment and purpose. The weather and the calendar pressed the decision further. Winter forced burial in haste. The trench on the hillside took the frozen dead while more bodies were found when the drifts lifted. The agency leadership at Pine Ridge could not afford another day like that one. They met with Oglala leaders and scouts and agreed on a narrow path to avoid further killing. Surrenders of arms continued by small groups. Patrols were restrained to close escorts. The crisis that had been called a war by distant editors became a slow and painful consolidation under watch and ration. If we ask what might have been otherwise, the record allows a careful answer in a few lines. With a wider perimeter and the guns held back from the rim, the search could have been delayed or staged by family cluster rather than by a single mass order. With seasoned interpreters posted to each company street and with the sick leader left undisturbed, a partial disarmament might have secured enough rifles to satisfy safety without tipping the camp into panic. With clear limits placed on artillery and a rule against firing into lodges, the risk of crossfire would have fallen sharply. None of these conditions required new law. They required time and restraint in the service of the stated objective. Yet counterfactuals cannot erase the structural forces already in motion. The allotment regime had broken land and authority. The ration system had converted food into leverage, while congressional cuts tightened hunger. The winter had fixed movement and raised fear. The ghost dance had been judged by distant readers as a threat when it was a prayer for balance. Those forces placed families and soldiers in the same narrow bowl with a rule set that privileged control over trust. The admission letters did not deny those forces. They recognized that leadership must account for them rather than sharpen them into fatal pressure. The national reckoning began in the mismatch between words and images. Reports spoke of an engagement. Photographs showed women and children in the snow. Editorials that had demanded firmness turned toward doubt and sorrow. Churches read names and dates from pulpits. Schools began to include the event in readers and histories. Museums collected ledger drawings and winter counts. The site itself drew visitors who stood in the wind and tried to understand the shape of the ground. This is the moment when a local tragedy became a lens through which a country measured its policies and its conscience. For the Lakota communities, the turning point was more intimate and more durable. Survivors organized the dead with care and prayer. Families took in orphans. Elders told the story to children who would one day speak to interviewers with steady voices. The winter count kept the memory compact and exact. The memorial rides that later crossed the plains followed the route in reverse and stitched together places whose names had been printed as mere coordinates in reports. Continuance became the answer to loss. Language classes opened in schoolrooms. Ceremonies persisted through pressure and law. The nation would debate words. The people would live the aftermath. By the end of winter, the Army had closed the immediate phase of operations, and the Interior Department had resumed the routine of allotment ledgers and school placements. The crisis had ebbed. It had also permanently changed the vocabulary. Battle could no longer cover what had happened at Wounded Knee Creek. The simpler and harder word had entered common speech. That word did not decide every policy or settle every argument. It did something more basic. It named a fact that forced coordination of memory across agencies, newspapers, classrooms, and the place itself. The turning point, therefore, is not a single moment or document. It is the convergence of a field of snow, a set of letters, and a public that would no longer accept the old story without the names of the dead. From that day forward, every account of the northern plains had to pass through that valley and through the sentence written by the department commander. The winter closed over the trench and the wind erased the tracks. The record remained and the communities remained. The country had begun to reckon. In the months that followed the massacre at Wounded Knee Creek, the northern plains were stripped of sound. Snow sealed the hills and muffled the roads, leaving only the creak of wagon wheels as burial details returned in January 1891 to collect the last of the bodies revealed by wind. The Army logged its reports in the same handwriting that had recorded other winter operations, toned and procedural, but behind the columns of numbers, the officers' notes carried an unfamiliar weight. The field was marked, the casualties tallied, the rifles counted. What remained uncounted was the change inside the people who had witnessed the valley in smoke. The first administrative wave came through the channels of the War Department. Colonel Forsyth was temporarily relieved of command while an inquiry examined his conduct and the tactical decisions made at the creek. No court-martial followed. Witnesses testified that confusion and panic had produced the slaughter, not deliberate malice. General Nelson A. Miles continued to press his criticism in private letters, but the official finding described the event as a regrettable misunderstanding. To Washington, this phrasing saved institutions from indictment. To the Lakota, it erased their dead once more through language. The Interior Department resumed authority over the agencies once the troops pulled back. At Pine Ridge, rations resumed in reduced form: flour beans, a little sugar coffee, and a thin cut of beef per family. Survivors of Spotted Elk's band were registered on the census as transferred the bureaucratic word for the displaced. Some children were taken to the mission schools at Holy Rosary and St. Francis, where their hair was cut and English taught under punishment. Others remained with relatives who refused the boarding system and lived along creeks or near the buttes, planting small gardens in spring. The federal records show a pattern of restabilization. In the spring of 1891, patrols were reduced and the garrisons withdrew to distant posts. Agency police resumed civil control. Courts of Indian offenses reopened. A new superintendent ordered the resumption of school attendance under the assimilation policy. The same year saw new leases for grazing and mining on the reduced reservation lands. In the ledgers, each signature represented an acre that would not return. For the Lakota families who survived continuity, required improvisation. They buried the dead on high ground and visited the place quietly through the next decades. The winter count kept the year marked as they were killed at the small stream. The meaning was known to every child without further explanation. In the 1890s, ledger artists began to draw the battle, the wagons, and the ridge. These drawings, made with ink and colored pencil on army paper, traveled through traders to museums in the East, where curators labeled them primitive records. In truth, they were depositions, visual testimonies left by the survivors who could not make themselves heard in the Army's inquiries. The human effects radiated far beyond the creek. Demographic reports for 1891, 1893 show steep declines in birth rates and spikes in mortality from pneumonia and measles at Pine Ridge and Cheyenne River. Food shortages continued until mid-decade. A generation of children grew up without parents or older brothers. Many were absorbed into the boarding school system, sent as far as Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and Hampton, Virginia. Letters from those institutions show students writing carefully in English about home, describing the landscape they had left and the stories their elders told of that winter. The wider nation, meanwhile, began its own uneven process of reckoning. In January and February of 1891, major newspapers printed the first photographs taken at Wounded Knee. Images of soldiers standing among frozen bodies, of a trench filled with the dead of the broken wagons under snow. These photographs appeared beside articles debating whether medals should be issued for bravery. 17 medals of honor were eventually awarded to soldiers of the 7th Cavalry for actions that day. The citations spoke of gallantry under fire, not of civilians caught in crossfire. The medals became a wound in themselves, and their continued presence in Army records remains contested more than a century later. Church organizations responded with sermons of repentance and calls for reform of Indian policy. Some missionaries at the agencies, long frustrated by government interference, wrote that the massacre had laid bare the failure of both departments. Others continued to preach assimilation as moral necessity. Congress debated appropriations, but not accountability. No compensation reached the survivors. The reform societies that had lobbied for the Dawes Act now shifted to campaigns for citizenship and Christian education, while Native families struggled simply to endure winter and rebuild homes under the same policies that had brought them to Wounded Knee in the first place. In the years that followed, the Lakota people turned continuity into resistance. Ceremonies persisted in quiet forms. The Sundance, banned by federal order, continued in hidden valleys. Women maintained traditional foods with what little ground remained. Men worked as scouts, farmers, or laborers at the agencies, carrying memory as a private creed. The oral tradition became the archive, each retelling careful with detail, naming relatives and places, avoiding exaggeration, so the story would hold weight when finally heard beyond the reservation. By the early 20th century, that persistence began to shape new spaces of memory. Ledger drawings appeared in exhibits, winter counts in publications, survivor interviews and ethnographic studies. James Mooney, collecting testimony in 1892 and 1893, recorded the ghost dance as a religion of peace and renewal, not rebellion. His reports reached academic presses and softened the official narrative, but the word massacre still divided editors and officers. In 1913, the Army officially restored Colonel Forsyth's standing. The contradiction between record and conscience endured. For the communities themselves, remembrance took physical form. Annual rides retraced the winter trail from the Cheyenne River to Wounded Knee, beginning in the late 20th century and continuing today. Riders young and old carry the names of those lost and stop at the valley for ceremony and prayer. Schools at Pine Ridge teach the history from both documents and oral accounts. Language programs reclaim Lakota words once forbidden in classrooms. The site is fenced, but open with a simple monument bearing the carved names of the dead and space for those still uncounted. The larger administrative aftermath of 1890 turned gradually into legal and cultural continuance. Court cases over land and sovereignty cited the massacre as evidence of historical injustice. In 1973, a new generation of activists occupied the same ground during a 71-day standoff with federal agents, naming their protest not rebellion, but remembrance. For them, the valley was not only a place of mourning. It was a living archive, a reminder that federal power once declared a camp under guard and then destroyed it. Today, the descendants of those families live across South Dakota, Nebraska, Montana, and beyond. They serve in tribal governments, teach in universities, and speak both Lakota and English. The memory of Wounded Knee remains in songs in classroom lessons and in the winter ceremonies that close the year. The meaning has evolved, but not softened. It is not a closed story, but a continual act of naming and endurance. Through all this, the original question why the massacre became a national reckoning finds its answer in layers. It did so because the official words failed to cover the facts, because photographs carried the truth where reports would not, because survivors refused silence, and because the nation faced with undeniable images of its own policy made visible in death could no longer pretend ignorance. The valley at Wounded Knee stands as both wound and witness, a place where history continues not as closure, but as continuity, each generation returning to reckon, to remember, and to keep the story alive. In the long arc of United States history, Wounded Knee endures not only as an event, but as a mirror reflecting the structure of power, the reach of policy, and the resilience of a people who refused disappearance. Historians across generations have examined the same documents, the after-action reports, the letters of General Nelson A. Miles, the ledger drawings of survivors, and found convergence on one central fact. What happened on the 29th of December 1890 was not an engagement between armed forces. It was the killing of a disarmed and surrounded camp. The scholarly consensus holds that Wounded Knee marked both an end and a beginning. It ended the military phase of Native resistance on the northern plains and began an era of enforced assimilation that would stretch well into the 20th century. It confirmed the final authority of federal policy over tribal life while exposing the moral cost of that control. The massacre became the last entry in the Army's long campaign against Native nations, but the first entry in a national conscience that could no longer accept the old language of progress unexamined. Debate remains on the numbers and the meaning. Army returns list about 200 Lakota dead, though Lakota oral tradition places the toll closer to 300. 30 soldiers were killed or wounded, many by their own fire. The medals of honor granted to some of those soldiers have remained a public controversy, with Native nations and historians petitioning Congress for their repeal. The controversy itself is part of the legacy, the question of whether a nation can celebrate valor where its own policy created tragedy. The massacre also reshaped the field of American history. It compelled historians to examine the mechanisms of conquest, law, economy, and bureaucracy, rather than only the battles. It turned attention to the civilian toll of expansion, to the structures of allotment, and to the erasure of native sovereignty under the language of reform. In universities, museums, and public memory, Wounded Knee has become a reference point, the threshold before which narratives of settlement must now pause and reckon. For the Lakota, the meaning endures through continuity. Families maintain ceremonies, speak the language, and ride each December along the winter trail from the Cheyenne River to the valley where their ancestors fell. The site is not silent. It breathes through song and prayer, through the sound of hooves and wind. Wounded Knee remains in memory because it forces the country to confront a recurring question. What happens when policy and fear meet families on frozen ground? It endures because the people who survived insisted that America look, remember, and understand. Wounded Knee lives in memory because people insisted on telling what they saw. Which moment in this episode will you remember a month from now? What respectful questions should we bring to elders, historians, or curators for a follow-up? And if you could ask one question to a witness from 1890, what would it be and why?